What would you do if the world took everything from you, and the only thing you could afford was the one thing everyone else had thrown away? For Maud Tillery, a young woman of 20 cast out by her own family, the answer was written in the dust of the Nebraska prairie. She bought a failed, forgotten farm for just $3 silver, an act of defiance that the whole county laughed at. But what they didn't know, what no one could have possibly guessed, was that the true value of that land wasn't in the soil, but buried beneath it. Settle in and stay close as we uncover the story of a dismissed girl, a worthless plot of land, and the secret that would redraw the map of her life forever. Let us know where you're watching from tonight, as we travel back to the harsh and hopeful frontier of 1883. The wagon wheel cut a final, weary groove in the dirt road before halting in front of the Redemption County Land Office. Maud Tillery sat motionless on the buckboard, her hands resting in the lap of her plain calico dress, the fabric worn thin as a prayer. She was a slight figure against the vast, indifferent horizon, her face framed by a severe bonnet that did little to soften the stark lines of her exhaustion. She had traveled for 6 days, leaving behind the green, orderly hills of Ohio for this flat, wind-scoured expanse. She had left behind the only home she had ever known, a place that was no longer hers. The memory was a fresh brand on her mind. Her father, his face a mask of thunderous piety, his finger pointing not at her, but at the door. "You will marry Mr. Abernathy," he had declared, his voice the final word of judgment. "Or you are no daughter of mine." She had looked at the florid, wheezing face of the man twice her age, a man whose wealth was his only virtue, and she had chosen the door. Her father had pressed a small, heavy purse into her hand. "This is your inheritance," he'd said, the words cold as coins. "Do not write. Do not return. You have made your bed." Now, in the pale afternoon light of a strange town, the weight of that purse in her satchel felt less like freedom and more like the anchor on a sinking ship. Redemption, Nebraska, was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place clinging to the edge of an endless sea of grass. Men in worn denim and sweat-stained hats stopped to watch her, their gazes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A lone woman, young and traveling without a husband or father, was an anomaly. A question mark in a land that preferred simple statements. Maud kept her eyes fixed on the peeling paint of the land office sign. She had spent the last of her father's money on the train ticket and the short wagon hire, saving only a few dollars. It was not enough for a respectable plot, not enough for a room at the boarding house for more than a week, not enough for anything but a final, desperate gamble. She drew a slow, steadying breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and distant cattle. Her grief was a stone in her chest, but beneath it, a harder, colder thing was beginning to form. It was resolve. It was spite. She would not fail. She would not crawl back to Ohio. She would take the last thing her father had given her and turn it into a life, even if it broke her. With a quiet grace that belied the tremor in her hands, Maud Tillery climbed down from the wagon, her worn boots sinking into the soft dust of her new and unforgiving world. She had nothing left to lose, which, she was beginning to understand, was its own kind of power. Maud pushed open the door to the land office, a small bell announcing her arrival with a tired jingle. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, old paper, and the faint, metallic scent of ink. Behind a tall wooden counter piled high with ledgers and maps sat a man whose shoulders sagged with the permanent weight of bureaucratic boredom. His name was Mr. Gable, the county clerk, and he barely looked up from the document he was scratching at with a steel nib pen. "Help you?" he muttered, his voice as dry as the land outside. Maud approached the counter, placing her small, calloused hands on the polished wood. "I'm here to purchase a parcel of land," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He finally lifted his eyes, taking in her simple dress and the youthful resolve in her face. He sighed, a sound that suggested he had seen this particular brand of hopeful desperation 100 times before. "Got a plot in mind?" he asked, already reaching for a large, leather-bound plat book. "Or just looking for whatever's cheapest?" "Whatever is cheapest," Maud confirmed, without a hint of shame. His lips tightened into a semblance of a smile. He flipped through several brittle pages, his finger tracing lines and notations. "Well, you're in luck, miss. We've got one parcel that's about as cheap as dirt gets. In fact, it's mostly bad dirt." He tapped a square on the map, a section marked with a faded name. Taggart. "The old Taggart place. 80 acres more or less. Folks say it's cursed. Taggart went bust trying to farm it. Man after him, same thing. Soil's thin, creek runs dry by June, and it's choked with buffalo grass and thistle. Been on the books for 5 years. No takers." Maud looked at the small, disregarded square on the map. It was remote, pushed to the far edge of the county, an afterthought. "How much?" she asked. Mr. Gable leaned back, enjoying this now. "The county's tired of looking at it. They'll take $3, silver." A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even relief, crossed Maud's face. It was a price she could pay. It would leave her with almost nothing, but it would be hers. "I'll take it," she said. The clerk blinked. He had expected her to balk, to ask for something better. "Miss, I feel it's my duty to tell you, you'd be throwing your money away. It's a hard piece of ground. Nothing grows there but disappointment." "I'll take it," Maud repeated, her voice firm. She opened her satchel and retrieved the small purse. With deliberate care, she counted out 3 heavy silver dollars, their rims worn smooth with time. She pushed them across the counter. The sound they made was solid, final. Mr. Gable stared at the coins, then back at her. He shrugged, the performance over. He was just a clerk, after all. He took a fresh deed from a drawer, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and began to write, his pen scratching out her name, Maud Tillery, granting her ownership of the most worthless piece of land in Redemption County. It was a fool's bargain, a purchase made of pride and last resorts. It was the only thing in the world that was truly hers. What secret could a piece of barren land possibly hold? Was this an act of foolish pride, or the first step toward a future no one could imagine? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. Because as Maud would soon discover, some boundaries are meant to be redrawn. As Maud stepped out of the land office, deed in hand, the afternoon sun seemed harsher, the stares of the townspeople more pointed. The news of her purchase, it seemed, had already spread. 2 women standing by the mercantile stopped their conversation to whisper behind their hands, their eyes following her with a pity that felt sharper than scorn. A group of men leaning against the livery stable chuckled openly, one of them making a gesture of sowing seed onto barren rock. Maud kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the wagon she had hired, pretending not to hear, not to see. But the heat rising in her cheeks was a testament to her shame. Her act of defiance now felt like a public spectacle of her own foolishness. Just as she was about to climb back onto the buckboard, a large shadow fell over her. "Well, I'll be," a booming voice drawled. "Looks like the Taggart curse has found its next victim." She turned to face a man whose prosperity was as plain as the dirt on her own boots was not. He was broad in the shoulder and in the belly, his face ruddy with sun and satisfaction. This was Silas Croft, a name she'd heard muttered in the land office, the owner of the sprawling ranch that bordered her new property. He looked her up and down, a smirk playing on his thick lips. "Heard you paid $3 for that patch of misery," he said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "I'd have given you 4 just to leave it be. It's an eyesore next to my land." Maud said nothing, her silence a thin shield against his contempt. Her driver, a quiet man named Jebediah, shifted uncomfortably on his seat. Croft took her silence as weakness. "You won't last the winter, girl. That land breaks men tougher than you. When you're ready to starve, you come see me. I might give you $1 for the deed, just to be neighborly." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and turned away, dismissing her as he would a fly. Maud climbed onto the wagon, her body trembling with a cold rage. Jebediah clucked to the horses, eager to be away from the suffocating judgment of the town. As they reached the edge of Redemption, where the last buildings gave way to the open prairie, a figure stepped into the road, holding up a hand. It was an old man, his back bent like a seasoned oak, his face a road map of wrinkles. He carried a gnarled walking stick. Jebediah slowed the horses to a stop. The old farmer, who introduced himself only as Elias, approached the wagon, his gaze not on the driver, but fixed intently on Maud. He looked from her face to the rolled-up deed she clutched in her lap, then out toward the horizon in the direction of her new home. His eyes, pale and watery, seemed to see more than just the grass and sky. After a long, unnerving silence, he spoke, his voice raspy with age. "Some lines ain't drawn in dirt, but in memory," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "Best listen to the old ones." He gave a curt nod, tapped his stick once on the ground, and shuffled off the road, disappearing behind a stand of cottonwoods. Maud stared after him, a knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. The words meant nothing to her, a nonsensical riddle from a strange old man. She dismissed it as the ramblings of age, but the cryptic warning lingered, another shadow added to the growing twilight of her doubts as the wagon rattled on toward the Taggart place. The journey from Redemption to her property took the better part of 2 hours. The dirt track dwindled from a road to a pair of shallow ruts, then to little more than a suggestion in the tall prairie grass. The landscape grew wilder, lonelier. Jebediah, the wagon driver, had remained mostly silent, a kindness for which Maud was grateful. He was a cousin of a friend from her church back east, the only connection she had in this entire territory, and his quiet presence was a small anchor in the overwhelming vastness. Finally, he pulled the horses to a halt. "This is it," he said, his voice gentle. "The Taggart place." Maud looked, and her heart sank. The clerk's description had been an understatement. It was a portrait of failure. The cabin, if one could call it that, was a sagging gray box of weathered planks, its roof bowed in the middle like a tired old back. The windows were dark, empty eyes. The fields on either side were a tangled mess of thorny weeds and pale, dead grass. A fence, made of splintered posts and rusted wire, limped around the property in a crooked, defeated line. And there, standing by a water trough green with algae and filled with dry leaves, was a creature that seemed the very embodiment of the farm spirit. It was a mule, so thin its ribs stood out in sharp relief against its dusty hide. Its head hung low, and one ear drooped, giving it an expression of profound, permanent dejection. This, apparently, was the last remnant of the previous owner's assets, abandoned along with the land itself. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through Maud's carefully constructed resolve. This was worse than she had imagined. This was not a farm. It was a grave. The wind picked up, whispering through the tall grass with a mournful sound, carrying the chill of the coming evening. Jebediah began unloading her meager possessions. A single trunk containing her clothes and a few books, a crate of basic provisions, and a small box of tools he had insisted she buy. "I can stay and help you for a day or two," he offered, seeing the look on her face. Maud shook her head, the motion stiff. "No, thank you, Jebediah. I need to do this myself." He hesitated, then nodded, understanding her need to face this trial alone. He left her with a canteen of fresh water and a promise to check on her in a month's time. As his wagon disappeared over the rise, the silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind. Maud was utterly alone. She walked slowly toward the cabin, the dead grass crunching under her boots. Inside, it was even more derelict. Dust lay thick on everything, and the air was heavy with the smell of decay and rodent droppings. In one corner was a simple cot with a rotted mattress. In the center, a rusted wood stove. That was all. That evening, as a sliver of moon rose in the ink-black sky, Maud didn't sleep on the cot. She took a blanket and sat on the cabin's sagging porch, her back against the rough wood, watching the stars blaze with a cold, terrifying brilliance. The thin mule, which she had decided to call Gideon, stood silently in the darkness nearby. His occasional heavy sigh, a lonely echo of her own. She felt the full weight of her decision then, a crushing burden of pride and folly. What had she done? The first light of dawn was a merciless thing, revealing every flaw and failure of her new domain. Maud rose, her body stiff from the cold night, and resolved to do the one thing she knew how to do: work. Her first task was to understand the boundaries of her failure. She would walk the perimeter of the 80 acres she now owned. She started at the corner nearest the cabin, following the dilapidated fence line. The wire was rusted through in places, the posts leaning at drunken angles. It was clear no one had tended to this fence in years. She walked for nearly an hour, the sun climbing higher, beating down on her bonneted head. As she came around to the northern edge of her property, the side that abutted Silas Croft's sprawling ranch, she noticed something odd. The fence here was different. The posts were still weathered, but not as deeply as the others. The wire, though showing spots of rust, was tauter, newer. And the line it cut through the land was aggressively straight, unlike the meandering, terrain-following path of the older fence. It sliced off a wide, promising-looking section of land that sloped gently down toward a meandering creek bed, lush with green grass even in the dry season. That fertile bottomland was on Croft's side of the fence. Her side was the higher, rockier ground. It struck her as an unnatural division. Farmers and ranchers typically used natural features like creeks or ridges to mark their boundaries. This fence ignored the creek entirely, running parallel to it about 50 yards up the barren slope. It made her parcel smaller, drier, and more difficult to work. It was then she noticed Gideon. The old mule had been trailing her at a distance, but now he stopped. He stood near a particular section of the new fence, his one good ear pricked forward. He lowered his head and nudged one of the posts with his nose, then took a step back and let out a soft, guttural bray. He pawed at the ground, his gaze fixed on a small cluster of 3 gnarled cottonwood stumps, long dead, that stood just on her side of the wire. Maud walked over to him. "What is it, Gideon?" she murmured, stroking his dusty neck. The mule didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the stumps and the fence post as if they held some profound significance. It was the first time the animal had shown any energy, any interest in his surroundings. Maud looked closely at the ground around the stumps. It was just dirt and weeds, same as everywhere else. She looked at the fence post. It was a solid piece of cedar set deep in the earth. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet the mule's strange insistence, combined with the odd placement of the fence itself, planted a small seed of unease in her mind. It was a detail that didn't fit, a note played in the wrong key. She didn't understand it, but she filed it away, a tiny question mark drawn on the mental map of her new, hostile home. For now there was a roof to patch and a well to clear. The mystery of the fence would have to wait. Days bled into weeks, each one a testament to the sheer force of Maud's will. She worked with a silent, relentless rhythm that became the new language of her life. She rose before the sun, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache, and worked until the last light faded from the sky. Her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, became cracked and calloused, nails permanently rimmed with dirt. She learned the heft of an axe, the bite of a shovel, the satisfying thud of a hammer driving a nail home. She scavenged planks from a collapsed shed to patch the worst of the holes in the cabin roof. She spent 3 back-breaking days clearing the well, hauling up buckets of stagnant water, mud, and rotted leaves until, finally, clean, cold water began to seep in from below. It was a taste more satisfying than any feast she had ever known. Her silent companion in all this was Gideon. The old mule seemed to draw strength from her labor, or perhaps from the regular offerings of fresh water and the patches of stubborn grass she cleared for him. A quiet, unspoken bond formed between them. She would talk to him as she worked, her voice low and steady, recounting her day, her fears, her small triumphs. Gideon would listen, his one good ear swiveling to catch her words, his soft brown eyes watching her with a steady, calming presence. He was her confidant, her witness, her only friend. And every day, their routine contained the same strange ritual. When her work took her near the northern boundary, the fence she shared with Silas Croft, Gideon would invariably stop his grazing. He would walk to the same spot by the 3 cottonwood stumps and stand there, patient and expectant. He would nudge the same cedar post, paw the same patch of dry earth. His insistence was so regular, it became part of the landscape, as predictable as the sunrise. Maud's curiosity, long suppressed by the demands of survival, began to stir again. One afternoon, driven by the mule's quiet persistence, she decided to clear the thick tangle of thistle and buffalo grass that choked the area around the stumps. It was hard, thorny work. The roots were deep and stubborn. As she dug and pulled, she began to notice the soil here was different. It was looser, as if it had been disturbed long ago. Most of the land was packed clay, hard as stone, but here her shovel sank in more easily. She was trying to pry out a particularly large rock embedded near the base of the fence post when it happened. Her shovel blade slid past the rock and struck something buried deeper. It didn't make the dull scrape of metal on stone. It made a low, hollow thunk, a metallic sound. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove, she knelt down. She dug around the spot with her hands, pulling away the loose soil. Her fingers brushed against a hard, straight edge. It was cold, metallic, and flaked with rust. It wasn't a rock. It was the corner of a box. Her heart began to beat a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. With renewed urgency, she grabbed her shovel and began to dig in earnest. The mystery of Gideon's obsession suddenly taking on a thrilling and terrifying weight. The prairie sun beat down on her back as Maud worked, her movements now feverish with anticipation. She dug carefully around the object, her shovel scraping against its sides, revealing more of its shape. It was a tin box, about the size of a small strongbox, its surface almost completely obscured by a thick crust of rust and hardened soil. It was heavy. With a final grunt of effort, she levered it out of the ground and dragged it onto the cleared patch of earth. It had been buried at least 2 feet deep, nestled right against the base of the cedar fence post, as if the post itself were a marker. A small, primitive lock, fused shut by years of corrosion, held it fast. There was no key. For a moment, Maud simply stared at it, her mind racing. Who would bury a box here? And why? The original owner, Taggart. The man after him. Was it treasure, or just some homesteader's forgotten keepsakes? Impatience won out over caution. She took the blade of her shovel and wedged it into the seam of the lid. Bracing her foot against the box, she put all her weight on the handle. The old metal groaned in protest. She pushed harder. With a final wrenching shriek of tearing metal, the lock broke and the lid sprang open an inch. Kneeling, she pried it open with her fingers. The air that escaped smelled of damp earth, oil, and time itself. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like rotted fabric, were two objects, both carefully wrapped in dark, oiled cloth. Her hands trembled as she reached in and lifted the first one. It was heavy, and it made a soft, clinking sound. She carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. Her breath caught. Lying in the center of the cloth was a small leather pouch, its drawstring pulled tight. With fumbling fingers, she loosened the knot and tipped the contents into her palm. Gold coins, not a pirate's treasure, but a homesteader's life savings. Double eagles, mostly, their surfaces still bright. The image of Lady Liberty clear and sharp. She counted 20 of them. $400. It was a staggering sum. More money than her father had given her. More than enough to see her through a dozen winters. Tears welled in her eyes. Tears of shock and overwhelming relief. But there was still the second package. She set the coins carefully aside and lifted the other object from the box. It was a long, thin roll, also wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a blob of hard, brown wax. She broke the seal, her heart pounding. The oilcloth fell away to reveal a roll of heavy paper, yellowed with age but still supple. She unrolled it carefully on the ground. It was a map, a hand-drawn survey, meticulously detailed with bearings, distances, and landmarks. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, Official Survey of the Taggart Homestead, Redemption County, Nebraska Territory, May 1872. She scanned the drawing, her eyes tracing the boundary lines, and then she saw it, the northern boundary. It wasn't the straight, arbitrary line of Croft's new fence. The map showed the boundary following the natural winding course of the creek itself, and there, clearly marked with a small X and the notation witness trees, was a drawing of 3 cottonwoods. On the map, they stood a good 50 yards inside her property line. The entire fertile creek bottom, the greenest, most valuable land for miles, was supposed to be hers. Silas Croft hadn't just built a new fence, he had moved it. He had stolen nearly half her farm. The cryptic words of the old farmer, Elias, echoed in her mind. Some lines ain't drawn in dirt, but in memory. This map was that memory, buried and waiting. A darkness was gathering on the western horizon, a bruised purple stain spreading across the brilliant blue of the afternoon sky. Maud, still kneeling on the ground, clutching the survey map, had been so absorbed in her discovery that she hadn't noticed the change in the air. The wind, which had been a steady, gentle presence all day, now began to blow in sharp, erratic gusts, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. A prairie storm was coming, and it was coming fast. She quickly rewrapped the gold coins and the map, placed them back in the tin box, and scrambled to her feet. She had to get back to the cabin, secure the animals, and protect her precious proof. But as she turned, she saw something on the faint track that served as a road to her farm. It was a wagon, a small canvas-covered affair, and it was in trouble. One of its rear wheels was canted at a sickening angle, clearly broken. A man was struggling with it, while a woman and 2 small children huddled beside the road, looking frightened and lost. A conflict, sharp and immediate, seized her. Her first instinct was to run, to protect her discovery. The box in her hands represented her future, her vindication. But the sight of the family, so vulnerable against the backdrop of the approaching storm, tugged at something deeper. This was her land now. They were on her land, and they needed help. Pride and fear warred with compassion. She took one last look at the darkening sky, then made her choice. Cradling the box, she ran not toward her cabin, but toward them. As she drew closer, she could see the panic in their eyes. They were immigrants, their English halting and heavily accented. "The wheel, it is broken," the man said. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "We are lost." They were the Schmidt family, he explained, headed for a homestead claim 2 counties over. There's a storm coming, a bad one," Maud said, her voice firm with newfound authority. "You can't stay here. My cabin is just over that rise. We can shelter there." Hope flickered in their faces. Together, they unhitched the family's horse and cow, and Maud led them, along with Gideon, in a hurried procession toward her small, patched-up home. Just as they reached the relative safety of the cabin, another rider appeared, galloping hard against the wind. It was Silas Croft. He reined his horse in, his face a mask of irritation. "Seen any of my stray cattle?" he barked, barely glancing at the frightened family. "Storm spooked a dozen head." "No," Maud said, her voice tight. "We're just trying to get out of the weather." Croft's eyes swept over the Schmidts, the broken wagon in the distance, and Maud's meager cabin. A sneer twisted his lips. "Harboring vagrants now, are we, Miss Tillery? You'll learn this land has no room for charity." Without another word, he spurred his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the growing gloom, leaving them to face the fury of the storm alone. Inside the small cabin, as the first drops of rain began to hammer against the roof, Maud lit a lantern. Its warm glow pushed back the shadows, illuminating the grateful faces of the Schmidt family. In that moment, holding the box that contained her future, she understood. This land wasn't just about lines on a map. It was about what you did within those lines. It was hers to defend, and its people were hers to protect. The storm broke with a violence that seemed to want to tear the world from its foundations. Wind howled like a hungry wolf around the corners of the little cabin, and rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very planks beneath their feet. Inside, the 5 of them and the 2 small children huddled together, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Mrs. Schmidt wept quietly, while her husband, a man named Carl, stared into the flame with wide, fearful eyes. Maud, however, felt a strange calm settle over her. She had made her choice. She had chosen community over solitude, compassion over self-preservation. She shared what little food she had, hardtack biscuits and dried apples, and gave the children her own blanket on the cot. She spoke to them in a low, soothing voice, her steadiness a rock for them to cling to in the tempest. The tin box, her secret and her strength, sat safely tucked beneath a loose floorboard. When morning finally came, the world was washed clean and glistening. The storm had passed. The air was cool and smelled of rain-soaked earth. The Schmidt family emerged from the cabin, their faces etched with relief and a profound, wordless gratitude. Carl Schmidt gripped Maud's hand, his eyes shining. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We will not forget this." Maud knew she could not delay any longer. She helped Carl temporarily mend his wagon wheel, enough to get it to town. She would travel with them. She retrieved the tin box from its hiding place, its weight a solid reassurance. With Gideon tied to the back of the Schmidt's wagon, she walked beside them on the muddy track back to redemption. This time, when she entered the town, she did not feel like a fool. She felt like a landowner with a purpose. She walked directly to the county land office, the Schmidts waiting for her outside like a silent, supportive guard. Mr. Gable was at his desk, looking even more tired than before. He looked up, surprised to see her again, and so soon. "Miss Tillery, don't tell me you're giving up already," he said, a hint of pity in his tone. "No, Mr. Gable," Maud said, her voice steady. "I'm here to correct a mistake." She placed the tin box on the counter. With deliberate care, she opened it and took out the surveyor's map. She unrolled it across the counter. "This," she said, "is the original government survey for the Taggart homestead." Mr. Gable leaned forward. His professional curiosity piqued. He adjusted his spectacles and studied the map. He saw the date, the surveyor's signature, the official seal. He saw the creek marked as the northern boundary. His brow furrowed. He turned and pulled the heavy plat book from the shelf, flipping to the page showing her property. He laid it open beside her map. The discrepancy was immediate and undeniable. The map in his book, the one the county recognized, showed the straight, clean line of a fence, the line that gave the creek bottom to Silas Croft. "This is a forgery," he murmured, tracing the fraudulent line in the book with his finger. A crude one, at that. Copied from the original, but altered. He looked up at Maud, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning respect. "Where did you find this?" "Buried," Maud said simply. "On my land." The quiet authority in her voice was absolute. Word of the discovery, carried by the Schmidts and the clerk's own stunned pronouncements, spread through Redemption like a prairie fire. Silas Croft was summoned. He swaggered into the office, blustering about his stolen cattle, but his voice died when he saw the two maps laid side by side on the counter. He saw the tin box. He saw the determined face of the young woman he had mocked, and he saw the townspeople gathering outside the office window, their expressions no longer filled with pity for her, but with judgment for him. Faced with the irrefutable proof, his bluster collapsed. He did not shout or protest. He simply paled, his arrogance shrinking away until he seemed a smaller man altogether. He was not thrown in jail. Land disputes were often messy, but his power, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled in a single morning. The town had seen the truth. In the months that followed, a quiet transformation took place. The story of Maud Tillery and the Taggart survey became local legend, a tale told in the mercantile and the saloon, a testament to a quiet woman's iron will. The laughter that had once followed her was replaced by nods of respect. People who had once pitied her now sought her out, offering a helping hand or a word of encouragement. Silas Croft, humbled and diminished in the eyes of the community, made no further trouble. Under the watchful eye of Mr. Davies, the county surveyor, and with the legal weight of the original deed, a new fence was erected. It was a sturdy, honest fence, its posts marching along the winding bank of the creek, restoring the stolen land to its rightful owner. The fertile bottomland was hers. The Schmidt family, having filed their own claim on a neighboring plot, became her first true friends and allies on the frontier. Carl helped her plow the rich soil of the creek bottom, and his wife Anna brought over fresh bread and shared seeds for a proper garden. The isolation that had once threatened to swallow Maud whole was replaced by the steady, comforting hum of community. One evening, as autumn began to touch the prairie with strokes of gold and amber, Jebediah came to visit. He stood with Maud on the porch of her now sturdy cabin, looking out at the expanded fields, the healthy crop of late corn, and the contented shape of Gideon the mule grazing by the life-giving water. The setting sun bathed the entire valley in a warm, benevolent light. "You did it, Maud," Jebediah said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "Everyone in Redemption is talking about it. You took the worst piece of land in the county and made it the best." Maud watched the light play on the surface of the creek, the water flowing freely and cleanly through her property. She thought of her father's angry face, of Silas Croft's mocking laughter, of the crushing loneliness of her first night. She had faced it all and had not been broken. She reached out and rested a hand on Gideon's strong neck, the mule nuzzling against her in a familiar gesture of affection. "I didn't buy a farm," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of all she had learned. "I bought a chance to put a line back where it belonged. It was a line between right and wrong, between stolen and earned, between what the world told her she was and what she had chosen to become. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience. If you were moved by Maud's determination to reclaim what was rightfully hers, we invite you to leave a like and a comment to share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of hidden strength and earned redemption from the pages of history. We'll see you next time. She was 22 and cast out by the only family she had left. With no plan, just a worn leather-bound book and $17, she bought the one thing nobody in Redemption Gulch wanted: a cracked iron church bell sold for scrap. But what the men who laughed at her didn't know was that sealed inside its heavy crown was a fortune in gold coin, and a confession that would call the town itself to account. Settle in and stay close for this story of quiet courage, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Ruth Calloway had been shaped by two men, one who gave her life and one who taught her how to live it. Her father, Thomas Calloway, was a botanist by training and a dreamer by trade, a man who saw the world not as a thing to be conquered but as a text to be read. He had filled a small, leather-bound journal with meticulous ink drawings of alpine flora, each petal and leaf rendered with a scientist's precision and a lover's care. He died, alongside her mother, in the winter of '68, when a fever swept through their small mountain homestead, leaving 8-year-old Ruth an orphan with nothing to her name but that book. The book was her most beloved object, a tangible piece of a love she could barely remember, but felt as a constant, quiet warmth against her ribs. She was sent to live with her mother's brother, her Uncle Reed, in the bustling supply town of Granite Creek. Reed was a man of ledgers and accounts, of profit and loss. He was not unkind, but his affection was a measured thing, dispensed like rations. He saw Ruth as a column in his ledger, an expense to be managed. She was fed and clothed and housed, but she was never home. For 10 years her life was a quiet, orderly affair of mending, cooking, and keeping out of the way. She learned to be self-reliant, because reliance on others was a currency she did not possess. She learned to be observant, because in a house where you are not central, you survive by noticing the currents and eddies of mood and intention around you. Her true education came not in her uncle's tidy house, but in the smoky, clangorous cavern of the town's smithy. It was run by Silas Blackwood, a widower in his late 60s whose hands were maps of scar tissue and calluses. Silas had been a friend of her father's, and when he saw the lonely girl with watchful eyes, he recognized the same steady soul. He never offered pity. Instead, he offered purpose. He began asking her for small favors: to work the bellows, to hold a piece of iron steady with the tongs, to fetch a specific hammer from the rack. He spoke to her not as a child, but as an apprentice. He taught her the language of metal, the way it spoke under the hammer, the different songs it sang as it cooled. He showed her how to read a fracture, to understand stress, to know when something was tempered and true, and when it was brittle and false. Most folks see a broken thing and all they see is the break, he told her once, his voice a low rumble beneath the hiss of the slack tub. They don't see the good steel that's left. The break isn't the end of the story, Ruth. It's just the point where a new one starts. He taught her about leverage, about how a small, well-placed force could move an impossible weight. He taught her that integrity wasn't about being perfect or unmarred, but about holding your essential nature, even after you've been damaged. Silas died 2 winters before her ejection, leaving a void that the whole town felt like a missing tooth. For Ruth, it was the loss of the only person who had ever seen her for who she was. Not a burden, but a capable woman with a quiet strength. It was his lessons, more than anything else, that she would carry with her into the wilderness of her own life. The end of her time in her uncle's house came not with a shout, but with the rustle of a paper. Her uncle, at 45, had decided to remarry. His intended was a widow from Denver, a woman of society and particular tastes. and she had made it clear that her new home would not include a grown, unmarried niece of no particular standing. The cruelty was administrative, as clean and cold as a line item in a ledger. One Tuesday morning, after breakfast, her uncle called her into his study. The room smelled of dry paper and old leather. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his large oak desk, a barrier between them, and cleared his throat. "Ruth," he began, his eyes fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "As you know, Mrs. Albright will be arriving next month. We have been discussing the arrangements for the household." He spoke as if outlining a shipping manifest. "It has been determined that it would be best for you to make your own way now. You are 22, a woman grown." He slid a small stack of coins and a few bills across the polished surface of the desk. "I have calculated your share. After deducting the cost of your room and board for the 14 years you have been under my roof, this is what remains. $17. It was not a gift. It was a final transaction, the closing of an account. There was no malice in his voice, and that was the worst part. It was simple, emotionless arithmetic. She was a debt that had been settled. Ruth did not argue. She did not cry or plead. To do so would have been to ask for something he was incapable of giving. She looked at the small pile of money, the sum total of her childhood, and gave a single sharp nod. She said nothing. Her silence was not one of submission, but of a profound and sudden clarity. She saw him, perhaps for the first time, not as her guardian or her family, but as a man who lived his life by a set of rules she could never subscribe to. She went to her small attic room, the place that had been her sanctuary and her cell. She did not own much. A few worn dresses, a sturdy pair of boots, a wool blanket. She packed them into a simple canvas satchel. The last thing she took was her father's journal of botanical drawings. She held it to her chest, the worn leather cool against her fingers. It was the only thing in the house that held any real value, the only thing that spoke of a love that was not measured or calculated. She walked down the stairs, past the parlor where her aunt-to-be's portrait was already waiting to be hung, and out the front door. She did not look back. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound as final and unremarkable as a clerk closing a ledger book at the end of a business day. She stood on the street of Granite Creek, a town she had lived in for most of her life, and felt like a complete stranger. She had $17, a book of flowers, and the quiet, unyielding strength that Silas Blackwood had hammered into her. She walked away from her uncle's house and did not stop until she reached the edge of town. The sun was climbing, and the morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn. She had no plan, only a destination, a name whispered to her years ago by Silas: Redemption Gulch. He'd called it a place where things went to be forgotten, a played-out mining camp clinging to the side of a mountain, populated by ghosts and stubborn old men. A hard place, he'd said, but an honest one. The mountains don't care who your father was. That honesty sounded like a balm to her raw spirit. She used $2 of her $17 to buy a place on a freight wagon heading west, deeper into the Rockies. She sat on a crate of tinned goods, her small satchel on her lap, her father's journal tucked safely inside. The wagon lurched and swayed, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the rocky road. For 3 days she traveled, watching the familiar landscape of Granite Creek give way to something wilder and more immense. The mountains grew larger, their peaks jagged against the sharp blue sky. The forests of pine and aspen grew thicker, the air thinner and smelling of resin and cold stone. The other passengers, rough-looking prospectors and a tired-looking family, paid her little mind. She was just another piece of human cargo, adrift in the vastness of the territory. The journey was a stripping away. With every mile, the life she had known fell further behind, becoming smaller, less significant. The sting of her uncle's dismissal began to fade, replaced by the more immediate concerns of survival. The gnawing in her belly, the deep chill that set in as soon as the sun dipped behind the peaks, the ache in her bones from the constant jostling of the wagon. She ate the dry bread and jerky she'd bought, and listened more than she spoke, gathering information from the chatter of the men. They spoke of claims and veins of silver, of rock slides and early snows, and they spoke of Redemption Gulch. They called it the Gulch, a place on its last legs, a town that had boomed and busted and was now slowly returning to the earth. The freight wagon went no further than a dusty crossroads called Jasper's Fork. From there, the driver told her, it was another 10 miles on foot, up a steep, winding trail. She thanked him, shouldered her satchel, and began to walk. The physical effort was grueling. The trail was little more than a goat path, and the altitude made her lungs burn. But with each step, a strange sense of ownership settled over her. This fatigue was hers. This struggle was hers. It was not imposed upon her by the quiet tyranny of her uncle's house. She was moving under her own power, toward a future of her own making, however uncertain. She crested a final ridge as the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Below her, nestled in a narrow valley, was Redemption Gulch. It was not much. A single, muddy street lined with a handful of weathered, false-fronted buildings, some of which listed precariously. A few cabins dotted the surrounding hillsides, smoke curling from their stone chimneys. It was a place worn by time and disappointment, but it was still there. It was still holding on, tired, dusty, and with a profound sense of having crossed a threshold into a new world. Ruth Calloway started down the final slope into town. Redemption Gulch was even more dilapidated up close. Many of the buildings were boarded up, their windows like vacant eyes. The ones still in use seemed to be leaning on each other for support. A saloon, a general store, and what looked like a livery stable were the only signs of active commerce. A few old men sat on the porch of the store, watching her arrival with the incurious stares of people who have seen everything come and go. There was no welcome, but there was also no judgment. She was simply a new fact in their landscape. She spent her first night in the corner of the livery, the scent of hay and horse a strange comfort. The next morning, she walked the length of the muddy street, taking stock. Her $17, now closer to $14 after her journey, felt impossibly small. She needed a place to stay, a way to earn a living. Her attention was caught by a hand-painted sign tacked to a post. Town auction. Noon today, all unclaimed property and scrap. At noon, a small crowd of about 15 people gathered in a cleared area near the edge of town. The auctioneer was a portly man with a booming voice that seemed too large for the quiet valley. He sold off a few mining claims that had gone to tax. A broken-down wagon, a set of rusty tools. The bidding was sluggish, the prices laughably low. Then, 4 men rolled the last and largest item into the center of the clearing. It was an enormous church bell, cast from dark, pitted iron. It lay on its side, a fallen giant. A jagged, ugly crack ran a third of the way up its side from the lip, silencing it forever. "All right, folks," the auctioneer bellowed. "Last item of the day. The old bell from the first free congregation. As you know, the church burned nigh on 10 years ago. This bell's been sitting in the town lockup ever since. We're selling it for scrap. Weight is near a ton. What am I bid for this piece of history?" A few men laughed. The bell was a local tragedy, a monument to a fire that had scattered a whole community of believers, many of whom had then left the gulch for good. It was considered bad luck, a massive, useless weight. "Come on now, the iron is good. Melt it down for shoes or tools," the auctioneer pleaded. "Who'll start me at $10? Silence. The men on the porch of the store spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Ruth, standing at the back of the small crowd, felt a pull she could not explain. She walked forward, her eyes tracing the lines of the massive casting. She remembered Silas Blackwood's lessons. She saw the maker's mark near the lip. She saw the elegant curve of the crown, the solid engineering of the cannons used for mounting it, and then she saw something else. On the very top of the crown, where the metal was thickest, she noticed a subtle hairline seam in a perfect circle, about the size of a dinner plate. It was not a casting mark. It was too deliberate. It looked like a plug. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She thought of Silas saying, "The break isn't the end of the story." $5, someone yelled, a mocking bid from the back. The auctioneer looked desperate. "I've got 5. Do I hear 6? Ruth stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but clear. $17. A hush fell over the small crowd. Every head turned to look at her, the strange young woman who had walked into town the day before. $17 was a fortune for a piece of scrap iron. The men who had been laughing now stared in disbelief. The auctioneer's eyes widened. $17 from the young lady. Going once, going twice. He slammed his gavel down on a wooden block. Sold to the lady for $17. A ripple of snickers went through the men. She had just spent everything she had on a ton of cracked, useless metal. She had no way to move it, nowhere to put it. She ignored their condescending smiles. She had just acquired the heaviest, most burdensome object in Redemption Gulch, and in doing so, had become utterly penniless. But as she laid her hand on the cold, rough surface of the bell, she felt not regret, but a deep, resonant certainty. She had seen something no one else had. The first problem was logistics. The bell was an immovable fact, a ton of iron and bad memories sitting in the middle of a muddy clearing. The men who had laughed at her purchase offered no help, watching with amusement as she contemplated her predicament. Ruth remembered Silas's lessons on leverage. She did not try to lift it, she tried to move it. She spent her last few cents on a length of thick rope and a meal for an old prospector who owned a tired-looking mule and a stone boat, a simple heavy sledge for dragging ore. The prospector, a man named Jebediah, was skeptical but took her money. Together, using a system of levers made from scavenged timbers and a great deal of patient effort, they managed to winch the bell onto the stone boat. It took them the rest of the afternoon. The mule strained and the sledge groaned, but slowly, foot by painful foot, she hauled her prize to the one place in town that was as abandoned as she was. A derelict smithy at the far end of the street. The roof had holes and the forge was cold, but its stone walls were sound. It was a place of work and it felt right. With a final, groaning heave, they slid the bell onto the packed earth floor inside. She had a home for it, but she was now truly destitute. She had no money for food, no tools, no claim to the building she was in. All she had was the bell and a secret suspicion. As dusk fell, she lit a single candle she'd found on a shelf. The flickering light cast huge, dancing shadows. Alone in the cavernous, cold smithy, she finally turned her full attention to the bell's crown. She ran her fingers over the hairline crack she'd spotted. It was definitely a plug, sealed with what looked like lead or pitch. She needed tools. Scouring the smithy, she found a rusty cold chisel and a heavy, short-handled hammer, their wooden grips smooth with the memory of another man's hands. They felt familiar, extensions of the lessons Silas had taught her. She placed the tip of the chisel into the tiny seam and struck it firmly with the hammer. The sound was a sharp, clear ping that echoed in the quiet space. For hours she worked. It was slow, painstaking labor. She moved the chisel a fraction of an inch, struck it, moved it again. A fine powder of rusted lead sifted onto the bell's surface. Her arm ached and her hands were raw, but she did not stop. She was not just breaking a seal. She was chiseling her way toward a new life. Finally, with a low grinding sound, the plug shifted. She put down her tools and gripped the edges of the metal disc. It was heavy, but it moved. She lifted it free. Inside was a hollow cavity, about a foot deep and just as wide, and nestled within it, wrapped in oilskin, were 2 packages. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached inside. The first was a canvas sack, surprisingly heavy and emitting a soft, clinking sound. She untied the drawstring and poured a portion of the contents into her palm. Gold, not dust but coins. Double eagles, dozens of them, gleaming in the candlelight. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever seen in her life. She set the coins aside, her mind reeling, and reached for the second package. It was a flat packet, also wrapped in oilskin and sealed with wax. She carefully broke the seal and unfolded the contents. It was a letter, the paper thick and the ink faded but still perfectly legible. The script was neat, precise. It began, "To whomever finds this in God's own time." She held it closer to the candle and read, "My name is Reverend Michael Keene. I was the pastor of the First Free Congregation of Redemption Gulch, from the year of our Lord 1865 until this day, October 12, 1869. If you are reading this, our church has been destroyed by fire, and I am likely dead. The fire was no accident. It was set by men who covet the land our chapel sits on, for they believe it holds a rich vein of silver. These men are Mr. Silas Croft, the owner of the saloon, and Mr. Jedediah Flagg, who holds the town's only freight contract. They offered to buy the land. I refused. They threatened my flock. We held fast. Tonight, I fear they will make good on their threats. I have sealed the last of our congregation's funds in this bell, $2,000 in gold coin, entrusting it to the Lord's safekeeping. With it, I seal my testimony, naming these men for their greed and violence. I do not know who you are, but I pray you are a person of courage and good conscience. Use this gold to rebuild. Use this truth to seek justice. May God guide your hand. Rev. Michael Keene." Ruth sank back on her heels, the letter shaking in her hand. The cold of the smithy floor seeped into her bones, but a fire was lit within her. This bell was not just a piece of scrap iron. It was a vessel of hope, a time capsule of truth, and a call to action. The men who laughed at her, the powerful men of the town, were the sons and inheritors of the very arsonists named in this letter. She was sitting on a secret that could tear Redemption Gulch apart, or, just maybe, piece it back together. The weight of the discovery was immense. The gold was a shield, a tool, a chance at a life she could never have imagined. But the letter was a sword. The names it mentioned, Croft and Flagg, were still the most powerful in the Gulch. The saloon and the freight company were now run by their sons, men who had inherited their father's wealth and influence, and likely their ruthlessness. To openly challenge them would be suicide. Ruth was a newcomer, a woman alone. She needed more than money and a piece of paper. She needed allies. She needed a community. Her rebuilding began not with a grand announcement, but with small, deliberate acts of construction. First, she secured her position. The next morning, she walked to the general store, which also served as the town's de facto records office. Using 2 of the gold coins, she purchased the deed to the abandoned smithy and the small parcel of land it sat on. The store owner, a weary man named Peterson, barely looked up. To him, she was just a fool throwing good money after bad. But for Ruth, the signed paper was a foundation. This place was now hers. With her new security, she began to work. She spent the next few days restoring the smithy. She patched the holes in the roof with scavenged tin. She cleaned the forge, clearing it of years of debris, and repaired the cracked leather of the great bellows. She organized the scattered tools, cleaning the rust from them, sharpening the edges, and arranging them on the racks as Silas had taught her. The work was hard and physical, but it centered her. Each swing of the hammer, each neat patch on the roof, was an assertion of her presence, her purpose. She was not hiding, she was building. Her first ally arrived not with a promise of support, but with a bowl of stew. She was an old woman named Elspeth, her face a web of deep wrinkles. She had lived in the Gulch for 40 years and had been a member of Reverend Keene's congregation. "Saw you working," Elspeth said, her voice thin but steady. "A woman needs to eat." She said nothing more, but she began stopping by every day, sometimes with food, sometimes just to sit and watch Ruth work. Her presence was a quiet vote of confidence. Soon others followed. The old prospector, Jedediah, A different Jebediah from the one named in the letter. A coincidence that felt like a grim joke brought her a broken pickaxe. Heard there was a smith in town again, he grumbled, though his eyes were sharp and curious. He had seen her haul the bell and respected the sheer stubbornness of the act. Ruth fired the forge for the first time, the roar of the flames a resurrection. She expertly reforged and tempered the pexaxe head, the rhythmic clang of her hammer on the anvil ringing out through the valley. It was the first time that sound had been heard in the gulch in 5 years. The sound was a declaration. The town had a heart again. Jebediah paid her and spread the word. Small jobs began to trickle in. A bent hinge, a broken shovel, a new set of shoes for a pack mule. Ruth worked diligently, her prices fair, her craftsmanship impeccable. She was earning her place, not with words, but with competence. After a week, she felt she could trust Jebediah. She showed him the letter. The old prospector read it slowly, his face hardening. "I remember that fire," he said, his voice low. "Always smelled wrong to me. We lost good people after that. The heart just went out of the place." He looked from the letter to Ruth, then to the massive, silent bell in the corner. "That bell found you for a reason, girl. What do you aim to do?" This was her moment. "I aim to rebuild," she said, "but not a church, a community." The smithy, once a derelict shell, slowly transformed into the living heart of Redemption Gulch. It was more than a place of business. It became a gathering point for the town's forgotten people. Elspeth's daily visits continued, and she began bringing others with her. Widows and old miners who had been part of Reverend Keene's flock, people who had been marginalized when the Crofts and the Flaggs took over the town's economy after the fire. They would sit on the benches Ruth had built, sharing stories, their quiet conversations punctuated by the steady, reassuring rhythm of her hammer. The bell sat in the corner of the smithy, a silent, potent witness. It was a source of quiet strength for the growing circle of allies. They knew the gold was hidden, a secret war chest for their cause. But more importantly, the bell itself became a symbol of their own resilience, cracked but not destroyed, silenced but still present. Ruth, Jebediah, and Elspeth formed the core of the new council. They understood that a direct confrontation with the Croft and Flagg families would lead to violence. Their power was not in force, but in the truth they held and the slow, methodical application of pressure. Their strategy, devised during long evenings around the smithy's dying fire, was one of economic reclamation. The gold from the bell was their primary tool. They did not spend it on luxuries, but on land. The original plot where the church had stood had been seized for back taxes years ago and bought for a pittance by the elder Croft. It had sat vacant ever since, the silver vein proving to be a fiction. Ruth, using Jebediah as her agent to avoid suspicion, began to buy it back, piece by piece, through a series of quiet transactions with Croft's son, a man more interested in whiskey than in his father's old landholdings. He was happy to sell the worthless plot. At the same time, Ruth used her position as the town smith to build a different kind of capital. She became indispensable. When a critical piece of equipment broke at the livery, she was the one to fix it. When a miner needed custom tools to work a difficult seam, she was the one who could forge them. People began to rely on her. Her name, once whispered with amusement, was now spoken with respect. They called her Ruth the Smith, a title of honor earned with sweat and skill. The community settling was not a single event, but a slow, organic process of trust being woven, thread by thread. One day, a young family whose wagon had broken an axle limped into town. The father, a carpenter named Samuel, had no money for the repair. Ruth fixed the axle in exchange for his labor, in helping her build a proper roof for the smithy. He and his family decided to stay, adding a new skill to the resurgent community. Elspeth organized the women to start a communal garden on a patch of sunny land behind the smithy. Jebediah taught the younger men how to pan for the fine gold that still washed down from the high peaks. Slowly, carefully. They were building their own economy, independent of the saloon and the freight company. The town was dividing into two camps: the old guard, centered on Croft's saloon, and the new community, centered on Ruth's smithy. The shift in power was subtle, but it was undeniable. Ruth was no longer an outcast. She was the anchor of a revived and hopeful town. One evening in late spring, a year after her arrival, Ruth stood in the wide doorway of her smithy. The fire in the forge was banked, its embers glowing with a soft orange light. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The day's work was done. A newly repaired plowshare rested by the anvil, ready for collection in the morning. Outside, the town was quiet. The raucous noise from Croft's saloon seemed more distant tonight, less important. Her gaze fell upon the object that now stood in the center of the reclaimed church plot, the bell. With the help of Samuel the carpenter and half a dozen other men, she had built a sturdy timber frame and hoisted the bell into place. It did not hang in a belfry, ready to be rung, but rested on a heavy oak cradle, its cracked mouth open to the sky. It was not a call to worship, but a monument to memory, a silent testament to what the town had endured and what it was now becoming. On her main workbench, smoothed by her own hands, sat two objects side by side. One was her father's leather-bound journal of botanical sketches, its pages filled with the delicate beauty of the wilderness. She had placed it there as a reminder of the quiet, observant love that had set her on her path. Beside it lay a single heavy gold coin, one she had kept back from the hidden cache. It was from Reverend Michael Keene, a man she had never met, but whose faith in a future stranger had given her a foothold in the world. The book from the father who loved her, the coin from the pastor who trusted her. They were anchors to two different pasts, both of which had converged to create her present. She thought of Silas Blackwood, of his gnarled hands and his quiet wisdom. He had taught her to see the value in broken things, to understand that a fracture was not an ending. The men of the Gulch who had laughed at her a year ago now tipped their hats when she passed. Young Croft, having sold off his father's ill-gotten land, was drinking his way through the proceeds, his power dwindling with every empty bottle. The truth of Reverend Keene's letter had never been made public. It was a weapon they held in reserve. Its power was in its potential, a final piece of leverage that ensured the old guard would not interfere as the new community grew. The gold had been their seed corn, and the bell their silent charter. Ruth Calloway had arrived in Redemption Gulch with nothing but $17 and a memory of love. She had spent it all on a broken bell, an act of desperate intuition. It was the soundest investment she had ever made. She had not found a fortune. She had forged a home, hammered out of loss and scrap iron, tempered in the fire of a shared purpose. She was no longer an outcast, but a founder. Ruth Calloway was 22 and had $17 to her name when she was cast out. She spent it on a cracked and forgotten church bell, and it was the best $17 she ever spent. It bought her more than a ton of scrap iron. It bought her a purpose, a community, and a home. What have you found value in that others have overlooked or cast aside? Let us know your story in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of quiet courage, be sure to subscribe and share this story with others.